ever get that feeling? Like you just really want to know where we come from? Kind of trace back the whole long story of like human evolution.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like fundamental curiosity, right?
Exactly. And today, well, we're really diving deep into that. We've got some really cool new research, and it's giving us a whole new perspective on a super important time in, well, our ancestry.
Absolutely. There's this fascinating new study. It was just published in the South African Journal of Science.
Yeah.
And the really exciting part, it's all about this fossil. It's almost, wait for it, 2 million years old.
2 million. Wow.
Yeah.
Ah.
It's a partial hominin pelvis. They call it DNH 43. And it was found at this place called the Drimolen main quarry in South Africa.
Okay, a 2 million-year-old pelvis. Finding that sounds incredibly difficult.
Oh, it's super rare. Like when you're talking about early hominin fossils, you almost never find associated pelvic bones. Like the sacrum and the hip bone.
Right.
But when we do find them, it's like striking gold and like blueprints. They give us all this information about how these early humans were built, how they moved around, and even how they, well, gave birth.
Okay, so let's back up for a second. Where exactly is this Drimolen site, and why is its age such a big deal?
So Drimolen main quarry, DMQ for short, it's in Gauteng province in South Africa. And get this, the fossils there, they date back to between 2.04 and 1.95 million years ago.
Okay.
Now, that time period, that's really interesting because the fossil record actually shows that there were multiple hominin species all living at the same time.
Really?
Yeah. So at Drimolen, you find Paranthropus robustus,
Okay.
alongside what we think are the earliest forms of Homo erectus sensilato. So basically, different types of early humans were all hanging out in the same spot.
Wow, that's incredible. So they're like neighbors, basically.
Exactly.
So this partial pelvis, DNH43, what exactly are the researchers trying to figure out about it? What's the big goal with this deep dive?
Well, they had a few things they really wanted to find out. First, they wanted to really understand the morphology, like the shape and all the little details of the DNH43 pelvis.
Okay.
Second, they wanted to see if they could figure out what species it belonged to. Like, could they test the idea that it came from a Paranthropus robustus, especially since they found a lot of Paranthropus skulls at Drimolen.
Right.
And third, they were hoping to learn more about the paleobiology of those early humans, like how they walked and the mechanics of childbirth.
That makes sense. So to be clear, they didn't have a complete pelvis to work with, right? Just parts of it?
Yeah, that's right. They had most of the sacrum, which is that triangular bone at the bottom of your spine.
Okay.
And then fragments of the right coxae, one of the hip bones.
Got it.
So to really study these pieces, they used some pretty high-tech stuff. Like they did surface scans to make these super accurate digital models. They even created a partial digital reconstruction.
A reconstruct.
Yeah, they basically mirrored the better preserved right side to get an idea of what the whole thing might have looked like. And then they 3D printed it so they could actually hold a model of it.
Wow, that's amazing. Taking a 2 million-year-old fossil and basically bringing it into the digital age.
It's pretty cool.
Now, I remember you mentioned that someone had looked at this pelvis before, but in a more general way. What did they think back then?
Yeah, when they first found DNH43, they just kind of looked at it and said it seems similar to both Australopithecus and Paranthropus pelves. But what's new with this study is they actually measured everything. They did quantitative analysis.
Quantitative analysis.
So instead of just describing it, they took precise measurements and compared it to a whole bunch of other fossils.
So it sounds like they compared it to a pretty big collection of fossils. What were some of the key ones they included?
Oh, they went all out. They wanted to compare it to a wide range of species from different time periods. So they included famous ones like Lucy, which is Australopithecus afarensis.
Yeah, I've heard of Lucy.
And they had other Australopithecus species, like Africanus and Setiba, plus several Paranthropus robustus specimens. And they even looked at early Homo fossils, Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, and even Homo floresiensis. Those are the hobbit people.
Wow, a real hominin family reunion.
Right. And to understand things like birth dimensions and how the sacrum was positioned, they also used data from modern humans and chimpanzees.
I see. So they're getting a really broad perspective.
Exactly. They also looked at some articulated pelves. Those are ones where the sacrum and hip bones are still connected.
Oh, cool.
Like they used ones from the Cima de los Huesos site in Spain, one that might be from Homo erectus, and a pretty recent Homo sapiens one.
So they really did their homework. All right, let's get into the results. What did all these measurements tell them about the sacrum of DNH43?
Okay, so the sacrum, which is called DNH43A, was pretty small, like about the same length as Lucy's sacrum.
Interesting.
But here's the thing. when they looked at this sacral plateau, which is the top part of the sacrum, they found that it was kind of narrow from front to back compared to its width.
Okay.
And that ratio, it was similar to what you see in Australopithecus afarensis and africanus.
Huh. So even though it might be Paranthropus, it still has this feature that's more like Australopithecus.
Right. Although, just to be fair, they did find one modern human male who also had this feature. So it
Right.
just shows you that there's always variation, even within our own species.
That's a good point.
But it is interesting to see this feature that's common in Australopithecus popping up in a potential Paranthropus from so much later.
Yeah, that does make you think. All right, so the sacrum has some Australopithecus-like features. What about the hip bone, the coxae DNH 43B? What did they find there?
Well, that was small too. And they saw that the auricular surface, which is where the hip bone connects to the sacrum, was small compared to the size of the acetabulum, the hip socket.
Right.
Then they look at the tuberoacetabular sulcus. It's a groove that's near where you sit. And that was kind of wide relative to the acetabulum.
Yeah.
And that's something you also see in Australopithecus and Paranthropus.
More similarities.
Then there's the acetabulosacral buttress, which is like a bony support structure.
Okay.
DNH 43B had a pretty gracile one, meaning it was slender compared to its length. Like imagine the support beams in a building. A gracile buttress means there was probably less weight on it or the weight was distributed differently. And that gracile feature, again, it's similar to Australopithecus and Paranthropus.
Gotcha. So it sounds like all these individual measurements are pointing toward a set of features that are more primitive, more like earlier hominins.
Yeah, that's the general trend. But they also did this thing called a cluster analysis, where they look at a combination of all these measurements together.
So instead of just looking at each feature separately, they're looking at the whole picture.
Exactly. And that cluster analysis, it actually grouped DNH 43B closest to two other specimens, OH28, which is often classified as Homo CF erectus,
Homo erectus.
and MH2, which is Australopithecus acidiba.
Okay, now that's interesting. So it's clustering with both an Australopithecus and an early Homo. What's going on there?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Mm-hmm.
The researchers think there are a few possible explanations. Maybe these groupings just reflect features that were already present in even earlier hominins, and these later species just kind of held on to them.
So like leftover traits from their ancestors?
Yeah, exactly. They also point out that maybe the specific measurements they used for this cluster analysis, maybe they're not the best for telling really closely related species apart. And the fact that DNH 43B clusters with MH2, the Australopithecus acidiba specimen, while some people think MH2 has some features that are kind of early Homo-like.
So maybe that explains that connection.
Possibly. And as for the link to OH28, maybe it's just because they both retained some of those really old traits. But the researchers are careful to say that OH28 is much bigger overall and has a much more robust buttress, so we can't read too much into that connection.
Got it. It's like they're acknowledging that the cluster analysis is a clue, but it's not the whole story.
Right. And there were actually some key Paranthropus robustus specimens they couldn't include in the analysis because those fossils weren't complete enough. But what they could see of those specimens did show some of these more ancestral features.
Interesting. Okay, let's move on to the sciatic notch. Isn't that the part of the hip bone that can sometimes tell you whether a fossil belonged to a male or female?
Yeah, the greater sciatic notch. It's that curved part of your hip bone. And in modern humans, it tends to be wider and more open in females. And DNH 43B has that kind of open shape, with the most curved point positioned forward, just like in modern human females.
So that sounds like a point towards it being female.
It could be. But here's the thing. We can't just assume that the same differences between males and females that we see today were also true for extinct hominins. Like, maybe things were different back then.
That's a good point.
It's also interesting that the Paranthropus specimens in the study, they also tended to fall within the female range for sciatic notch angle, based on modern humans.
Huh. So maybe that feature isn't as clear-cut as we thought.
Exactly. And then there were some Australopithecus specimens and a subadult Homo erectus that had a kind of weird combination. Wide angle like females, but a more male-like position for the most curved point.
Okay, so it's complicated.
Yeah. And they even point out that the Homo erectus measurement, that's based on a reconstruction, so we got to take that with a grain of salt.
Fair enough. So the sciatic notch gives us a hint, but there are a lot of caveats. Okay, what about the reconstruction of the entire pelvis? What did that tell them?
All right, so when they put the sacrum and the hip bone together digitally, they found that the pelvic inlet and the bispinous breadth, those are measurements that tell us about the width of the birth canal, those were kind of narrow from side to side.
Okay.
But the biacetabular breadth, the distance between the hip sockets, that was similar to modern humans.
Interesting. So kind of a mix of narrow and wide.
Right. And the really interesting thing was when they compared those width measurements to the size of the acetabulum, DNH43 had a relatively wide pelvis, like wider than most other specimens. The only ones wider were Lucy, the Australopithecus afarensis specimen, and a pelvis that might belong to a female Homo erectus. And Australopithecus sediba was similar in its relative biacetabular breadth.
Hmm. I wonder what that means for how they moved around.
Well, a wider pelvis, especially with a wide biacetabular and bispinous breadth, could mean that they had a bigger pelvic outlet. And that might mean they had a different way of giving birth, maybe a non-rotational birth mechanism, which some people think is how Australopithecus gave birth.
I see.
They also say that a wider pelvis could have affected how they walked. Maybe it allowed for more rotation of the pelvis, which could have helped them maintain stride length even if their legs were shorter.
That's fascinating. So the shape of the pelvis could affect both walking and giving birth.
Exactly. And they even say that the current evidence suggests this wider pelvis wouldn't have made walking more difficult.
Cool. Okay. One last thing about the pelvis. They also looked at pelvic incidence, which I think is the angle of the sacrum, right?
Yeah, it's the angle between the sacrum and the hip bones. And this is where things get really interesting. They found that DNH43 had a pelvic incidence of 56 degrees.
Okay.
Now, that's basically the same as the average for modern humans. And it's higher than what's been measured for Australopithecus afarensis and africanus, although all of those fall within the range of variation we see in humans today. But Neanderthals, they tend to have a lower pelvic incidence.
So DNH43 is more like us than Neanderthals in that way.
Exactly. And the researchers think this means that the way the spine and pelvis work together in Australopithecus, and probably in Paranthropus, if DNH43 is one of those, it was probably pretty similar to how it works in modern humans. Like, think about how you stand up straight. Your pelvis and spine are working together to keep you balanced. Well, pelvic incidence is basically a measurement of that angle. And the fact that DNH43's angle is similar to ours, it suggests that these early humans had a pretty modern way of standing.
Wow, that's amazing. So even though it has some primitive features, the overall way the pelvis is oriented is more like us. So after all this analysis, what's the final verdict? Do they think DNH43 belonged to Paranthropus robustus?
They think it's a reasonable guess, but they're not totally sure. They say it's a provisional attribution.
Provisional. So like a maybe?
Pretty much. And that's mainly because of those primitive features, which fit with what they saw before, and because Paranthropus robustus is the most common hominin they found at Drimolen, based on skulls and teeth.
Makes sense. But they're not rolling out other possibilities.
Definitely not. They're very conscious about saying it's definitely Paranthropus, because they've also found early Homo at Drimolen, specifically Homo erectus sensilato.
Right.
And the truth is, we just don't have that many complete skeletons from Paranthropus or early Homo.
So it's hard to be 100% certain without more fossils to compare it to.
Exactly. Plus, Paranthropus and Homo might be closely related, like sister groups on the evolutionary tree. So they might have inherited similar features in their pelvis from their common ancestor.
So an early Homo could have a pelvis that looks kind of like a Paranthropus pelvis.
It's possible. So they're basically saying we need to find more fossils, especially more complete skeletons, before we can say for sure what species DNH43 belonged to.
That's a good reminder that science is always a work in progress.
For sure.
All right, so to wrap things up, what would you say are the biggest takeaways from this deep dive into DNH43?
Well, I think the main point is that this pelvis, which is almost 2 million years old, it's got this really cool mix of features. It's got some primitive stuff that links it back to Australopithecus and Paranthropus.
Okay.
But it also has some things that look more like early Homo, and then the way the sacrum is oriented that's super similar to modern humans.
So it's like a mosaic of old and new.
Exactly. And while the researchers think it's probably Paranthropus robustus, they're not closing the door on other possibilities. We need more fossils, to be sure.
I see. It's like we've got a few pieces of the puzzle, but we're still missing some.
Yeah, and it's amazing how much we can learn from even a single fossil. It gives us a glimpse into a time when our ancestors were still evolving and adapting to their world.
And why is this particular fossil, this pelvis, so important for understanding the bigger picture of human evolution?
Well, it gives us clues about how hominins were walking, giving birth, and what their bodies were like around 2 million years ago. And that was a really crucial time because there were different hominin species all living together, probably adapting to different environments.
It's amazing to think about all those different species all in one
I
place.
know, right?
Yeah,
It makes you wonder what it would have been like to see them all.
it really does. So, thinking about all this, the mix of features in DNH 43, the fact that there were all these different hominins living at the same time, it really makes you think about what life was like for them. What kind of evolutionary pressures were they facing? What does this tell us about how diverse they were and how they were adapting to their world? It's incredible to think about, and it makes you wonder what other discoveries are out there waiting to be made. What if we find another pelvis, or even a skull that's connected to a pelvis from this same time period? Every new fossil has the potential to change our understanding of these ancient relatives and how they fit into our own evolutionary story. And that's what makes this field so exciting. We're always learning something new.